Greetings, greenhouse people. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and in an effort to provide this critical information in any way you choose to consume it, we are pleased to offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is Chris Ferguson, a technical specialist with Ball Seed, who's here to share production protocols for Calibrachoa as part of our Tech on Demand series covering key annuals and perennials commercially produced around the world. Calibrachoa might be the number one vegetative crop in terms of retail appeal, but like many crops, all stages of production require careful attention to avoid losses, and Chris is here to help you reduce risk in this process. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find dozens, if not hundreds, of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. But that's enough out of me. Chris, welcome to Tech on Demand, and why don't you go ahead and jump right into your presentation and help the growers optimize their Calibrachoa production.
Hey, thanks, Bill. So when you're thinking about Calibrachoa, one thing we know is that there are a lot of varieties, there are a lot of series, and there's a lot of cultural information out there that's specific to those varieties. But that's not what I want to do today. Today, I just want to give 5 general tips that are true for all Calibrachoa to help you grow a successful crop. So those 5 tips are going to be moisture management, no pinch techniques, trying to avoid the traditional mechanical pinch, pH management, Thielaviopsis, and budworm control. Moisture management is important for all crops, but especially for Calibrachoa early in production. If you're too wet, you're going to see something like this picture. You're going to see tip abortion or tip atrophy, and that's going to lead to blind plants, stalled out plants, uneven growth. And then if your roots are too wet, you're going to see poor nutrient uptake because those roots have rotted off and they're not able to take up proper amounts of water or nutrients. And it's also going to expose them to root rot diseases. On the other side, if you're too dry, like most plants, you're going to get root damage. And then when you re-wet, it exposes it to possible diseases. And you're going to see, those traditional stress symptoms of yellowing and wilting and dieback. So you really have to stay in the right zone. So I talk to a lot of growers, and I usually ask them, how do you train your growers? What do you do to train them to water correctly for moisture management? And they usually say that, when we hire them, we'll train them as soon as we hire them. And then every year we'll have some sort of a training over water management. And that's really good. But you also have to remember that it's a bit of a subjective thing, watering. One grower's too wet or too dry or just right is going to be different from the next growers. So it's nice to have a standardized measurement to know where you're at. So when you're looking at the Ball Red Book or you're looking at a culture guide, you're going to see them reference water levels from 1 to 5. But what does that mean? What does that feel like? What does it look like? Well, a level 1 is completely air dried. If you pick out that plug or that liner and you squeeze it hard, no water's going to come out. And then when you open up your hand, it's just going to fall apart because there's not enough water to hold that soil together. A level 2 would be similar. If you squeeze it, no water's going to come out. But when you open your hand, there's going to be just enough water in those micropores to keep that soil from falling apart. A level 3 would be squeezing that pretty firmly, and you see a few drops of water come out. At a level 4, if you squeeze lightly, water's coming out. And then at a level 5, you're going to see water in your hand. The soil itself is going to glisten because it's just super saturated. So that's kind of what we're talking about with these different water levels. But you can take it a step further and you can assign numerical values to it. So how do you do this? Well, if you want to know what your water levels are for, let's say, a 288 cell tray, take 2 trays. One of them you're going to fill with soil, leave it out for 3 or 4 days, make sure it's completely air dry. The other one you're going to fill up with soil, and then you're going to water it in until water's just streaming out the bottom, completely saturated. And you want to walk away for about 30 minutes, and you want to come back after it's drip dry so that basically it's holding the most amount of water that it can, but it hasn't evaporated any yet. And so then you'll weigh those 2 trays. So let's say that your level 1 is 500 grams and your level 5 tray is 1,500 grams. Well, now you can take those 2 values, you average them, and you know that a level 3 is about 1,000 grams. And then you can average your level 3 and your level 5, and you can get a level 4 of about 1,250 grams. Same thing for level 3 and a level 1. You average those, and your level 2 would be about 750 grams. So you can take that information and you could say, okay, I went out and I weighed 3 trays of Calibrachoa, and they're at about 1,250 grams. So I know that they're at a level 4. And I'm going to wait overnight, and I'm going to see how much water they lose overnight. You can also look at this and you can weigh your trays before and after you irrigate. And you can say, okay, after 4 passes, we gained 200 grams of water. That means we're adding 50 grams every pass. So now you know how wet you are, how long it takes to dry down to the next level, and how many passes you need to make to get back to where you want to be. So where do you want to be? So with Calibrachoa, from the time you stick through callus formation and root initiation, all the way until you start to see those roots hit the edge of the cells, you want to be about a level 4. And once you see them hit the edge of the cells, you want to let it dry down to a level 2 and start oscillating from that level 2 to a level 4 and let it fill out. And you want to do this all the way through finished container as well. Now, you're not going to put your finished containers on a scale, but you do need to go out there and pick them up randomly and see how heavy they are. And also notice how long they stay that wet, because you don't want them staying wet for way too long, because that's going to open you to root rots and diseases and things like that. You don't want them to get stagnant. The next topic is no pinch techniques. So Dr. Nathan Jonke and his team have been looking at this to avoid labor, because labor costs are expensive and they're not getting any cheaper. And the other issue is the risk involved with mechanical pinching. So anytime that you create a wound on a plant, it opens you to possible disease. So you can see here, this person is pinching with a hedge trimmer, which is a common practice, but that's a lot of wounds and a lot of potential for these plants to start to go downhill. So how does this work? Well, when you have a shoot tip, as you see in this picture, there's a lot of hormones going up and down the shoots. So auxins will travel down the shoot tip, and that will help your root growth. But it also inhibits those lateral buds from breaking and then branching. So once you trim off the top of that shoot, that signal becomes much weaker, and now that lateral branch can start to come out and grow. So you can do this with a mechanical pinch, but you can also do this with synthetic plant growth regulators that will basically trick the plant into pushing out those lateral buds. Okay, so before we go too far, I also want to say that there's a lot of varieties. Again, there's a lot of series of Calibrachoa. So they are going to respond differently to these plant growth regulators. So just because you found the magic mix for one variety does not mean that you can spray it on everything. You really need to test it on all your other varieties before you do a blanket spray on all your crops. So you can see these pictures here of different branching. There's a low amount of branching, moderate amount of branching, and then that high amount of branching. That's exactly what we want to see. That's something very similar to what you would get from a mechanical pinch. The other thing to think about is make sure that your roots have already hit the edges of the liner, and if you're in finished production, that those roots have hit the edge of the container, because these PGRs, while they help with lateral growth, they can also slow down your root growth. So make sure that you already have the roots there before you apply this. Nathan and his team were working with 2 different chemicals. They were working with Florel. Florel is ethafon, which is the precursor to ethylene. Most people know about ethylene as the chemical related to bananas ripening. It can also cause petal drop in cut flowers, and it's what makes those geraniums start to yellow up prematurely. But it can also be involved. It can also be used as a chemical pinch to chemically abscise that connection in that plant and cause those lateral buds to grow. Your other chemical is Configure. Now, Configure, some growers may be used to Configure with Echinacea or hostas, inducing that basal bud to branch out. They have noticed that Configure can cause phyto on Calibrachoa, but Nathan and his team have noticed that when they mix Configure with Florel, you don't see that phyto as much, and you see a lot more branching. So you can see in these two pictures in the bottom, on the left side there, that is a plant with a standard mechanical pinch. And then on the right side, that is no pinch technique with the tank mix of Configure and Florel. Now, one thing to mention here is that with those chemical pinches, you don't get rid of that apical shoot. So sometimes you get that growth and it's a little bit asymmetrical off to the side. Now, when you're putting these in large containers, multiple Calibrachoa together, they're going to fill out nicely and it's going to look really good. But this might not be the route for you if you are growing them and selling them by themselves in, let's say, a 4-inch container. Okay, so this is from some of Nathan's trials. You can see they have 5 different treatments here. You have the control, the no pinch control. The second at the top in the middle, that is your standard 1 pinch. Then you have a Florel application, a Configure application, and the last is a tank mix of that Configure and Florel, which came out the best, gave that reduced apical shoot and more laterals, and it's the closest that they've seen to a standard pinch. And then here on the right, these are some growers that actually use PGRs to try to chemically pinch. And again, you can see that apical shoot is still there and getting a bit long, but there are a lot of lateral shoots coming on, and it's going to fill out nicely given a little time. So this is definitely an option and something that you'd have to play around with and definitely trial it. But there is a potential there where you can avoid the labor and the cost and the risk of mechanical pinching. Okay, next is pH management. So Calibrachoa, similar to petunias, they like their soil to be a little bit more acidic. When the soil gets too high, say above 6.2, you're going to see iron deficiency. Iron is less soluble at that pH, and so the roots can't take it up. It's also an immobile nutrient, so that iron is not going to translocate from a lower leaf to an upper leaf. So the result is you start to see interveinal chlorosis. They start to get yellow. Eventually, when it gets severe, they turn white and they bleach, and then you may even see tip necrosis. Another issue is at high pHs, it's a prime environment for Thielaviopsis, so it's much easier for Thielaviopsis to attack Calibrachoa at those higher pHs. So if you stay down in that 5.4 to 5.8 range, you're going to be able to uptake the nutrients you need and stave off some of that Thielaviopsis. Okay, another thing you want to think about is your water quality. I like for all the growers to at least send in a sample and know their water quality. At least once a year, send in a sample. And depending on your water source, you may want to do it more often. Let's say your source is a pond and you get heavy rains and then you get drought and then the season changes. That's all going to affect your water quality. So one of the main issues with water quality is alkalinity. Alkalinity is what drives your pH and dictates what fertilizer formulations you're going to use. So alkalinity is basically how well or how easy it is for you to adjust your pH. So you want to be around a 30 to 60 parts per million. That's ideal. But if you're anywhere between 20 to 120 parts per million, you should still be okay. Once you start to get above 120 parts per million, that's when you're going to need to pull out the sulfuric acid and the nitric acid and try to drive that pH back down and drive that alkalinity back down. On the other side, if you have 0 parts per million of alkalinity, well, then you're having all these crazy chemical reactions and the pH is moving all around. There's no stability. So you need a little alkalinity just for that stability. And the last thing I want to say is if you're trying to inject acid to control that alkalinity and you need to know how much you're going to apply, there is a nice calculator called OutCalc, and you can also find this on eGrow's website. And basically all you have to do is input your current pH and alkalinity and then put in what your desired pH and alkalinity is, and it can help calculate that for you. So it's a really nice resource. Okay, and then you also want to think about your substrate with pH management. So the substrate that you buy generally will have some sort of a lime buffer in it, and that will last for a limited amount of time. Depending on the crop that you're growing, A lot of growers will have issues with geraniums later in the season with iron and manganese toxicity. And this is because one, it may be the fertilizer that they use. If they're using a 20-10-20 or a 20-20-20, it's acidic, it's breaking down that lime buffer. And also, geraniums are inherently more acidic. They make the soil more acidic. They're pumping out these hydrogen ions and they're acidifying the soil. So over time, you're going to lose that buffer. So you need to think about your substrate. You need to think about your alkalinity, and you need to think about your fertilizer choices there. Okay, so now we're going to move into Thielaviopsis. This is a very common issue with Calibrachoa, but it can also be a very serious issue. And one of the reasons is because of the spore types. So there are two spore types. It has an endoconidia, which is these thin-walled small cells, spores, and they're going to last for weeks to months. But you also have chlamydospores. These are a much thicker walled spore, and these can last up to years in your greenhouse, in cracks and crevices, and in soil, leftover plants. So you have to be careful with that. Now, your symptoms are going to be similar to other root rot diseases: chlorotic lower leaves, poor roots, lack of growth, wilting, but you may also see blackening of roots. And if you see blackening of roots, especially if it's black and it's kind of fuzzy, that could lead you to believe that you have Thielaviopsis. Now, you always want to send off a sample and get a diagnosis and make sure you know what you have. But that blackening on the roots is related to those chlamydospores, those thick, those dark spores, and that's actually what you're seeing there, and that's why it has the name Thielaviopsis. Its common name is black root rot, so that's where it comes from. So how does it spread? Well, the number one way it spreads is through fungus gnats and shore flies. And then once it makes those spores, they'll be in the soil, and anywhere that infected soil goes, that's where it's going to be. So on your trays, your benches, your tools, on dirt on the bottom of workers' shoes, and they track it around the greenhouse. So to manage this, you want to start off with making sure that your pH is right, like we've said before. 5.4 to 5.8 is going to reduce that Thielaviopsis growth. You also want to discard any symptomatic plants as soon as possible. Make sure you get them out of the greenhouse. And then you want to thoroughly disinfect areas, especially between crop cycles, to break that green bridge. So get rid of all the soil and debris, and then disinfect your tools, your benches, your floors, and make sure you're using a chemical that'll do the job. If you're using bleach, it needs to be at least 10% strength. And then you can use hydrogen peroxide with peroxyacetic acid like azyrtol or quaternary ammonia. All these will be good to help clean up your greenhouse and sterilize it or sanitize it. Chemical controls for Thielaviopsis, you have things like T-methyl, fludeoxonil, or triflumazole. You can use any of these. Make sure you're rotating different modes of action, following the label. But you also want to control those fungus gnats and those shore flies because they're spreading all these spores around. So one of the ways you can do it is by beneficial nematodes. Steinernema feltiae is sold by Nemesis, but there's a lot of other trade names. This is going to be really good for attacking the fungus gnat larvae. There's also another nematode, which is Steinernema carpocapsae, and that one is more effective on your shore flies. So if you have both, it would be good to use both of those nematodes for control. As far as insect growth regulators, you can use something like Adept or Citation to help break that life cycle. And then conventional chemicals, you can use something like Pylon or Safari to help control those fungus gnats as well. And then lastly, tobacco budworm. So this can be a damaging crop, very unsightly. And so when you're thinking about the life cycle, the adult female is going to lay these eggs, usually 18 to 25 in mass, and that's going to be on flower buds and terminal growth. There's going to be about 5 larval instars. They start out kind of green, and then as they get older, they may kind of tan into like a green, tan, brown, sometimes a maroon. But this is the destructive stage, the larval stage. All 5 instars, they're feeding, and then after that 5th instar, once they fed enough, they're going to drop to the ground, cover themselves up, and they're going to pupate in the soil. And this is dependent on temperature. So if it's much hotter, they may pupate in about 11 days. And if it's much cooler, it may be closer to like 3 weeks before they emerge as an adult. And the feeding that you're going to see on here is it's going to be on the flower buds, it's going to be on the petals, and it's going to be on the leaves. And it's going to be very unsightly, but it also opens the plant to diseases. So, how do we manage it? Well, number one is you need to be scouting. You need to scout your entire greenhouse, and not just Calibrachoa, because these budworms will feed on petunias and geraniums and verbena and snapdragon. So it has a wide host range and they can fly. So you need to scout everything. Now, you can use biological controls, something like Bacillus thuringiensis kerstocki, also known as BTK. It will produce a toxin. And so when the budworm feeds on the leaf and eats that bacteria, that toxin that it produced will disrupt the digestive system, effectively killing the larva. You can also use a trichogramma wasp. This is a parasitic wasp where the female will deposit eggs inside of the budworm egg. And so that trichogramma larva will hatch first and it will start to eat the contents of the budworm egg, effectively killing it. And then you can also use conventional chemical control, something like spinosad, bifenthrin. All these will be good. You can start to use them preventatively early in the season, but you also need to spray right before you ship or sell so that you have a little residue and residual control for customer satisfaction. So those are my 5 tips for Calibrachoa.
Those are great. Very concise. I think that most of our listeners probably grow Calibrachoa. So putting some of these tips into practice going into spring 2026 is probably going to go a long way in making sure that crop starts and finishes as healthy as you can. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill.
And you can find so many Tech on Demand educational resources online, hundreds of them. And every week I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. We've created hundreds of videos for greenhouse professionals of all skill levels. Tech on Demand podcast is a great way to learn about technical topics on the go. And you can jump onto our Facebook group, the Greenhouse Tech Team, and join more than 6,000 of your peers. All you have to do is search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a couple questions, and I will let you right in. Chris, thank you again so much for your time. And I know we're going to talk again soon because we got a bunch more crops to cover, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Awesome. I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, and on behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Take care out there.